Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Lunch Bunch with Dr. Judy. My name is Kate Wood. I'm a Community Partnership Manager with Delaware Hospice. Today's topic is loving the mosaic that is you. Once Dr. Judy gets started, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. So please leave yourselves on mute until the end, at which point you can ask questions. And if you prefer, you can either unmute yourself and ask questions then, or you can put them in the chat and I'll ask them to Dr. Judy. And also Dr. Judy's got an exciting announcement for next month. So take it away, Dr. Judy.
All right. Well, here's the good news. We're finally going to be meeting live and in person. Next month, February 3rd, we're going to have our first live and in-person lunch bunch. A lot of people have been missing seeing one another and having an opportunity to do some of the group exercises we do when we're live and in person. So we're going to meet at the Lewis Senior Center, and it's open to anybody who wants to attend. There's no fee. There won't be any lunch either. And we also will be starting at 1 o'clock versus 12:30 because they have some kind of exercise class in there until 12:30, and we need them to have time to clean up and me time to set up. So we'll start at 1 o'clock next month, February 3rd, and it will be at the Lewis Senior Center. The address for that, I'll make sure it gets out with all the announcements and links for the video. But I'll give it to you now, 32083 Janice, Janice Road in Lewis. It's sort of over by Nassau, on the other side of the Nassau Bridge, over by the new fire station. Some of us vote over there. You might know where that is. But anyhow, make sure those details go out when we send out the link. It's because we will continue to live stream this so the people who don't live close by or anxious about being in a group of people can still see it, and we will still continue to record it so that people that miss it can see it. But I know people have been really hankering for an opportunity to get back together, and so this is what we're going to do. And we're probably going to alternate between the Lewis Senior Center and the one up in Milford, because that'll make it easier for the Kent people when we're up there, make it easier for the Sussex people when we're down in Lewis. So more details to emerge, but I'm very excited that both senior centers have welcomed us to have our lunch bunch there. Hospice is still operating under the same rules as hospitals. So if we were to meet in the conference room at hospice, we'd be able to hold all of 16 people. So we want to have a room big enough for as many people want to come as, we'll probably be able to fit in as many people as come. And again, if you have a friend, a neighbor, family member that you think would be interested in any of the topics, please bring them along. Next month, what we're going to talk about is overcoming loneliness, making and maintaining rewarding social connections. Research shows that social connection enhances emotional well-being, physical health, and even longevity. Best predictor of long-term longevity is connection with other people. But how do we develop, nurture, and sustain rewarding connections? This presentation next month will focus on creating quality relationships in adulthood. It's a different kind of friendship. It's also more difficult to meet people. You're not in college together or necessarily on the job together, or you don't go to bars and meet people that way. So how do we develop friendships in our later years? We'll also explore how to unlock the more love in your current relationships, as well as reap the benefits of what are called micro moments of connection. A smile that's exchanged, words of compassion, a hug, an empathic look, an understanding look, and just listening creates a powerful connection that increases emotional and physical health for both sender and receiver. And you've heard me talk about this before. These exchanges create a biochemical changes in both the person who's giving and the person who's receiving, things that improve your physical and your emotional well-being and enhance your ability to connect even more meaningfully. So there's this expression, love begets love, and we'll talk about that. So I'm very excited that we're going to be able to finally meet in person. But again, we will continue to live stream for those of you who are not close by or who can't make it that day. We'll continue to record it. So let's talk about the topic today, which is loving the mosaic that is you. You've probably heard me say some of this before, but I wanted to pull it all together into one presentation. Walt Whitman said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And Whitman's description of himself is really true for most of us. We're full of all kinds of internal contradictions and complexities. I like to think of the human psyche as a many-roomed mansion. Some rooms are prettier than others, some are tidy and very pleasing, and some are very messy. And of course, the rooms we show people the most are the ones we take pride in, and we feel others will find more acceptable. And we hide or live in fear of people seeing or stumbling into those sort of less noble rooms that exist in our house. But learning to love and accept all the parts of the self really is key to emotional well-being. We all have disowned parts of ourselves. I'll talk about that in more length, but being aware of those disowned parts both gives us more control over them, but it also often holds important messages, those rooms, because the rooms we don't show others really often reflect the hurts that still need caring and attention. They represent the parts of ourselves we don't like, and they're often the parts that refuse to lie about the fact that we still hurt inside, that we're still carrying some kind of emotional wound, and you've heard me say that before. So they contain kernels of truth about feelings and needs that are probably going unmet. And I'll give you good examples in a few minutes. But understanding what is right about what is wrong with you comes from looking at these less noble parts with eyes of compassion and understanding their roots, understanding where they spring from. And because at the end of the day, we really want to learn how to have no enemies within. That means, we don't want to have parts of ourselves that we view as the enemy. We want to be able to look at them with compassion and understand what they're trying to tell us. Ultimately gives us more control over them, but more importantly, it allows you to be a more full, lush, authentic, open, rich, compassionate person, and to have a rich and compassionate life. So that's why it's important to expose those parts of ourselves, or at least make peace with them. I'll read a quote toward the end from the woman who wrote No Enemies Within. She says, I'm not asking you to kiss the garbage. What she means by that is you don't have to love some of these parts of yourself that you consider less noble, but you have to make peace with them and understand where they come from and take the kernel of truth that is available from those rooms. But let me say more, and this might make more sense as we go along. We have a public self. That's the person we try to project into the world. It's often shaped by what we learned was pleasing to those whose approval we needed to win, parents, authority figures. We learn what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors aren't rewarded, and we learn very early what behaviors are ways of being in the world make the people that we want to make happy. And we really do mold ourselves to that. Now, sometimes they really do represent genuine passions and preferences, but the degree to which we grew up with acceptance or developed self-acceptance as we got older is the degree to which our outer self is then congruent with our inner self. But I often say to people, it's not like your public self is all false and all the parts that you hide behind it is the real self. The truth is you're a mix of both of those. You're a mix of the person that you present publicly. You're a mix of some of the parts that you don't like to show other people. In fact, over the course of your life, you have assembled a very rich mosaic that really does make up all of you. And that's, I think people often think, well, I have this fake self I put out in the world. Like I can be very competent and look very together, but there's a little part inside of me that feels like I don't know what I'm doing at all, and is very freaked out. And so we're afraid that really that little scared kid inside us is our real self. No, you do have that capability of being a competent adult in the world. So that's you too. But the scared part is also part of you. But it's not like one or the other is the real you. The truth is the real you is that whole conglomerate of different pieces of the self. Now, Nathaniel Braden, who wrote a book, The Disowned Self, kind of defines the idea of a disowned self. And he's talking about sort of the shadow sides of our primary personalities. They're often the polar opposite of who we put out into the world. So if you were forced to be very independent as a child, you likely disown the parts of you that really long to be taken care of and that feel needy and wish somebody would take care of them for a change. So often we do kind of because if it was not okay to be needy when we were kids, then we learned very quickly, I don't have any needs, people will like me. Adults will like me if I don't burden them with my needs. So you get very good at presenting yourself as not needing anything. But of course, back behind the screen, there is also a part of you that's longing to be taken care of. And that's healthy that you haven't completely lost that part of yourself. If you're taught that it wasn't okay to get angry when you were growing up, you often strive probably to be very pleasant, and you disown the parts of you that get angry. And you may have buried a ton of anger and have quite a bit of resentments built up over the years. It certainly wasn't okay in my family to get angry. My mother got angry, but my mother was mentally ill. So I thought of anger as something that crazy people, showed. But what I've learned is if you just try to bury that stuff, you don't bury it dead, you bury it alive, because the anger is still down there. And there's no way you can go through life without ever feeling angry. I had somebody say to me once, no, I'm never angry. I just don't have that in my being. And I thought, well, you got it buried pretty good then, if you really believe that. But I don't know how you go through life and not have, things annoy you, people annoy you, traffic annoy you. I mean, there's just no way you don't feel angry sometimes. So, if somebody tells me that, then I know it really wasn't okay for them to be angry when they were growing up. So again, often the person they present is sort of the polar opposite of the disowned part, because the disowned part is not acceptable to them, or it wasn't acceptable to others growing up. If you always had to be the good person, the responsible person, the disowned part of yourself really wants to rebel and is sick of being so responsible and would love to be irresponsible. If you grew up in a household where children were to be seen and not heard, well, then underneath this shy exterior is probably a person who's longing to scream, to take center stage, or simply make their voice heard. So that is the polar opposite of the quiet, I don't take up too much space person. But down deep, there is this little kid who always wanted to make noise and be heard and have people respond to them. A disowned part of you may also be a part of yourself that simply never got the nurturing it needed to grow, but which remains a potential that's longing to flourish. For example, if you grew up in a practical family, now I don't know if this is true for all Irish families, but in my Irish side of the family, it was like you get a civil service job when you graduate, you'd get a practical job, good benefits, you'll be employed for the rest of your life. You have to be very practical. You have to think about how you're going to pay your bills. So those of us who grew up with that really practical approach to life, very well may have an artist who's yearning to express itself in words or song or paint or dance. We may have parts of ourselves that never got expression because they weren't practical and they wouldn't serve us well in the job market. So sometimes those disowned parts of ourselves are simply the parts of ourselves that never had a chance to be nourished and really are longing to be nourished so that they can flourish and manifest themselves. Disowned parts may also reflect things you were told about yourself as a child. For example, if you were told your brother is the smart one and you're the pretty one, it may have discouraged you from embracing the parts of you that were smart and loved to learn. You may even falsely believe that you lack the intellectual ability to learn new things. Parents set us up that way. So inside there still may be a part of you that would really like to try something or study something new, but mistakenly fears you won't be successful. And that comes from being told you're not the smart one. So again, the disowned parts of the self are often parts of ourselves that we were led to believe didn't exist. But again, the disowned self is not necessarily the real self, and the other self, the false. You are all of those things. You are somebody maybe who is afraid of taking intellectual risks or is reluctant to, do study or take a course because you're afraid you fail. But there's also a part of you inside that's going, I want to try it. So the bigger the split between the public persona and the more hidden parts of the self, the more you may fear that the hidden self is the real self, but it's really not. It's just a disowned part of yourself that needs a lot more airtime and maybe screaming at you a lot more because it's not getting it. People often wonder, for example, like, did I help that person because I'm really a caring person? So you see a woman who needs help getting her groceries out of her car into her house. You go over there and help. Did you do that because you're really a caring person? People ask me this. Or did I do it because it makes me feel good about myself? Well, the truth is you probably did it for both those reasons and maybe other reasons. Like maybe when I'm old and need that kind of help, maybe it'll be reciprocated because I did it now. There's no one good motive and one bad motive. The presence of a less noble motive doesn't cancel out the good. It fails to understand the complexity of human beings if you think it's a dichotomy. Like either I did it for a good reason because I'm so empathic and caring, or I did it for a bad reason, which is I just want to see myself that way. Well, it probably is a little bit of both, and that's really okay. That's being human. But don't do that like one cancels out the other. That's similar to like, don't think your public self, if it's very different from your private self, cancels out the public self. It doesn't. We are complex human beings with multiple competing contradictory parts. So don't get hung up on this idea that there's a good self and a bad self, or there's good reasons you do things or bad reasons you do things. We all do everything for a multitude of reasons. And that's just part of being human, and one doesn't cancel out the other. So why do we hide these parts of ourselves? And I think based on how I'm describing it, you can figure that out. We're afraid of being judged by others. If we hide part of ourselves that growing up drew the judgment of our parents or other authority figures, we're likely to fear that people will have that same response today. Even though some part of us knows we're not a kid anymore and they don't have that power over us, the little kid in us still sort of is afraid that if we show this part of ourselves, like if we let people know that we actually are kind of needy and we would like to lean on people periodically, we're afraid people will run for cover. It's also possible that if you're a caregiver to the world, you've created a world where the people in your world are people who only want to lean on you and aren't very open to you leaning on them, in which case you need to expand your support network and find some people that aren't afraid of that part of you. But it doesn't take much. Judgments when we're children can be as subtle as sort of a raised eyebrow or just the withdrawal of attention. It doesn't mean that it was beaten into us. It can be far more subtle. But that subtle stuff is much more powerful because we don't even realize sometimes that we internalize something from somebody else that really wasn't us. It was a message we got. It was a belief we internalized on the way people reacted to us. And it wasn't they beat us with sticks when they were telling us that. They just let us know that they disapproved when we said or acted in certain ways. I told this story before, but I remember I was at my Aunt Helen and Aunt Agnes's house. We just come back from the seashore, which is my idea of heaven, and I'd always get to go to the seashore with them for a week. So I'm waiting in their home for my parents and family to come get me, and that's already an anxiety-provoking time because I'm heartsick over leaving the beach and not necessarily thrilled about going home. And I remember hearing something on the television, and they said it was raising money for something international. And I repeated something I'd heard from somebody. I don't even think I knew what it meant, but I said something like, well, maybe we should take care of people in this country first. I don't think I had any clue what that really meant, but I thought it would make me sound smart because I heard it from an adult. Well, my Aunt Helen whirled around and said to me, that is selfish. Don't you ever be selfish. And that stuck with me. I mean, she probably would, if she were alive today, would have no clue or even remember that event. But to this day, it really stuck with me. So sometimes it's very subtle, but it really profoundly shapes us because we want to win the love of that person, and we learn that that's not something they like. Feelings of shame often force us to overcompensate. Shame is this core belief that you're flawed or defective, in some way that would make the tribe want to kick you out. Most of us walk around with some sense of shame that we have some flaw that if people ever knew about it, they wouldn't really want to be our friends. So sometimes we create very exaggerated false selves because we're trying to overcompensate for the feeling that we are actually flawed. Often that leads to feeling like we have to be perfect in order to hide this internalized belief that actually something is really wrong with us. And since it's impossible for any human being to be perfect, we live in constant fear of having our imperfection exposed and attach the meaning that that imperfection being exposed would mean that people wouldn't like us anymore. Adults who weren't, as children, weren't adequately affirmed, who did not have their specialness mirrored back to them, or those who were just emotionally neglected are also at risk for needing to hide parts of themselves. Each of us needs to believe that we, the person inside us, is worthwhile and valuable. And the needed first step in developing that capacity is having someone significant provide that affirmation of self. Children learn to love themselves by being loved. Gradually, we begin to internalize those affirmations if we get them. And when we get enough externally, we kind of build up a little bank of good feelings about ourselves that we can then draw on when nobody's around to affirm us, that we can then affirm ourselves. But we build this internal source of valuing first by receiving love. People always say to me, well, shouldn't I be able to love myself just from within? Well, yes, but you know what? If you didn't grow enough of that when you were growing up, if you didn't get enough of that validation, that message that you're okay, and God forbid they should actually make us feel like we were special or good. If you didn't get enough of that, you don't always have that to draw on. You don't have enough of it to draw on because initially that's really, it does need to come from the outside in. And then once we get it in, we can hold on to it. But many of us did not get that kind of mirroring. Mirroring is like you hold the, oh shoot, sorry. Mirroring in this belief that, the parent holds up to a mirror and says, look how special you are. You're so smart. You're so articulate. I had a grant. He wasn't really my uncle. He's like fifth uncle or something. But I remember him telling somebody, and I overheard it, that he couldn't believe how easily I talked, how articulate I was. I don't know that would have been a word I knew then, but I know that's what he was saying. It meant the world to me, and I held on to that for dear life. And I'm somebody now who, of course, values being able to articulate thoughts. Again, that was a little bit of mirroring, somebody saying, look at this special quality you have. Most of us did not get nearly enough of that. We're lucky if we just didn't get beat down all the time or criticized all the time. We also hide parts of ourselves because of the lies we were taught about ourselves as children, often in comparison to another sibling. Your sister was the good kid. You were the problem child. So we hide the parts of us that we think represent that problem child. So we also hide parts of ourselves because of the psychological wounding we experience. So if your vulnerability as a child was abused or neglected or exploited, you learn to hide anything that you feel makes you look vulnerable or feel vulnerable. If vulnerability led to being hurt as a child, whether it was subtle or extreme, then you are very likely to hide any parts of yourself that make you feel vulnerable. So, for example, a boy who gets beaten for crying, he's going to repress that crying. He can get angry probably, but he's never going to let himself cry again because that made him vulnerable and he got picked on and told that's not what men do and all that kind of mishigas. If our longings for affirmation or affection were unmet, we bury our longing because it's just too painful to want something you never get. That's what kids learn to do. I don't need it anyway because it hurts too much not to get it. If you were sexually abused as a child, you may hate or hide away parts of your body or all of your body. Part of the reason people sometimes carry a lot of weight has to do with the fact that their body was a source of vulnerability. They were sexually abused, they were hurt through their body, so they hide their body. So that's some of the reasons we hide away parts of ourselves. Now, why is it so important to go back and claim all the parts of themselves? Not just doing this to torture you, I assure you. The point is not to give control over to those disowned parts of yourself, but to be aware of those disowned parts of yourself, so you actually have more conscious control over it rather than it unconsciously controlling you. So, for example, if you can't bear the feeling of vulnerability, you never put yourself in situations where you feel vulnerable. You probably don't let people get too close to you. You don't take risks where you might fail. And so in a lot of ways, that fear of vulnerability is really running your life because you're doing everything you possibly can to avoid that feeling of vulnerability. So unconsciously, that fear of vulnerability and those vulnerable parts of yourself are really running your life because unconsciously, they drive a lot of your behavior. So the goal really is to attend and identify those as disowned parts and find safe ways to allow that part of you to express itself, but also to get the love and affection and acceptance it probably needed and understand what it's rooted in so you can address its underlying needs. So, for example, if owning your anger, if you weren't allowed to be angry, it might be really important to be able to own the parts of you that are angry. Now, that doesn't mean you have permission to express your anger any way you want to. You still have, I would say, never should on your feeling. The feeling is always okay. It's what would you do with the feeling that could be problematic. So if you're realizing that you've disowned parts of you that get angry, it's important to be able to let yourself know when you feel angry. The should comes in terms of how you express that anger. You don't get to just punch somebody out or hurt somebody because you're angry. You don't get to just rage at somebody and just say, well, I feel so much better now that I released my anger. No, you still have responsibility for how you express that anger. So maybe you write a really angry letter you never send, or you scream into a pillow, or, my favorite, smash ice cubes against a brick wall. So you still have to take responsibility for how those parts of you get expressed. It's just really important to let them emerge because cutting them off is you're paying a price for it. And also the disowned parts of ourselves contain wisdom that we need to pay attention to. That's why we need to pay attention to these disowned parts. They're parts of ourselves that refuse to lie about the fact that we still hurt inside. You've heard me say that many times. If you strive for perfection, it may be because deep down you never feel like you're good enough. And since nobody is perfect, you probably repeatedly feel like you're not good enough because you're still striving for that perfection, because you think that's what you need to be in order to be loved. The most embarrassing symptom you have is the part of you that refuses to lie about the fact that you hurt inside. It is sort of a coded message from your insides. It's an unconscious kind of attempt to both mask and reveal an underlying problem. May seem irrational, but if you peel back the layers, you'll probably discover that it has a very profound and logical meaning. I know you've heard me say this in other talks. For example, if you have a strong need to be in control all the time and you become anxious when you're not in control, you probably grew up in a very unpredictable household. And your way of feeling safe in life is to make sure life feels pretty predictable for you. You develop this kind of hypervigilance where you're always scanning the horizon for any danger that could be coming upon you, and you're trying to anticipate problems before they even happen. So that grows out of a part of you that did not feel safe. You grew up in an unpredictable household, and guess what? The adults didn't protect you. They probably were the source of the unpredictability if you had an alcoholic or rageaholic parent. Um, so you learned that I need to be the one scanning the horizon. I need to be the one always anticipating any problems and head them off at the pass. Now, again, you're not a controlling person as much as you're somebody who's so scared that this is the only way you feel safe in life. Not feeling in control feels incredibly and intolerably vulnerable for those of us who grew up with unpredictability. So most of our enduring kind of personal struggles or our bad habits are rooted in childhood experiences, and they started as a way to cope with too little love or too much criticism or too much unpredictability. And they unfortunately become patterns that no longer serve us as adults sometimes, but they're very hard to let go of because they really are rooted in an attempt to win love or avoid painful feelings or bury unmet needs or to dodge physical or verbal attacks. So people often wonder why they can't just stop a behavior they dislike because it's irrational. Well, the reason they can't is it's important to understand these behaviors served a deeper and a usually very unconscious purpose when you were younger, and letting go of them feels dangerous to a part of yourself. So, like I said, if always having to be alert and in control, you probably hate that you do it all the time now because it leaves you feeling exhausted and more out of control than in control. But it's a survival mechanism that's not easy to let go of. If you grew up with a lot of criticism, and you'll probably be excessively self-critical today. Part of what you're doing is in order to avoid other people pointing out your flaws, because maybe somebody in your life did, like a parent or an authority figure, you want to beat them to the punch now. So you judge yourself and you criticize yourself before anybody else can see it and say it to you. So rather than somebody seeing your imperfection and pointing it out, you now do it to yourself. You're constantly criticizing and monitoring yourself so that you avoid somebody else and the painful experience of somebody else pointing out that you're flawed or that you made a mistake. But that means that you're now constantly living under the scan of a critic that's always going to point out what you're doing wrong. And again, it was meant to protect you initially, but it can be very hard to live with. So our symptoms, our habits, the disowned parts of ourself serve, or at least used to serve, a purpose. Judith Herman wrote about how children adapt to child abuse. And I think what she has to say is relevant even if your mistreatment was not severe or ill-intended. She said, when it's impossible to avoid the reality of the abuse, the child must construct some system of meaning that justifies it. Inevitably, the child concludes that her innate badness is the cause. The child seizes upon this explanation early and clings to it tenaciously, for it enables her to preserve a sense of meaning, hope, and power. If she is bad, then her parents are good. If she is bad, then she can be good. If somehow she has brought this fate upon herself, then somehow she has the power to change it. If she has driven her parents to mistreat her, then, if only she tries hard enough, she may earn their forgiveness and finally win the protection and care she so desperately needs. So children blame themselves because at least that way they feel they have some element of control. If it's me, maybe I can fix it. It's also too scary to really realize as a child that your parents are not safe or good people. It maintains the hope that maybe if I just change myself, I'll finally win that love. But it comes with a very high price tag because it really isn't the child's fault and the parent really isn't likely to change. So at the end of their childhood, they may have already come to the belief that, there is something wrong with them and they failed and they never did the right thing or found out the right thing to do to win mom and dad's love. So important that we understand the purpose that a habit or a symptom can serve in order to unhook from it. And again, knowing where it originated, knowing that it probably originated from a place of this is how I feel safe, this is how I win love, this is how I get attention, helps us understand why it's so hard to just stop it. And examining the purpose of a problematic behavior and understanding the roots of it, first of all, makes you feel a lot less crazy because even though it's irrational, you now can realize why it makes sense in a whole lot of ways when you were little that you adopted that strategy. It helps us understand why it's so challenging to stop the behaviors we don't like. It can help reduce that self-criticism that you're already engaging in far too much. It increases the likelihood that you'll start to accept the parts of yourself. And finally, it can help you address the core or sort of underlying wound from which it springs. Rumi said, this is a great quote, "That which haunts us will always find a way out. The wound will not heal unless given witness. The shadow that follows us is the way in. So Rumi is saying, that's which haunts us, that comes from a wound, is not going to go away. It's not going to heal until you bear witness to it, and maybe the people that love you bear witness and give you different messages. And the shadow, the part of yourself that you're embarrassed about, that is your way into understanding that wound. The other reason we want to acknowledge disowned parts of ourselves is because they leak out anyway. For example, the person who always has to be nice may be kind of passive aggressive. It's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to tell people off. It's not okay to express your needs. So, that anger goes somewhere, and it may come out in more passive aggressive forms of anger. Learning to be kind of appropriately assertive is a way better way to integrate your anger into your life and your assertiveness. But again, if you were taught that it's not okay to be angry, then it probably leaks out in the form of more passive aggressive kind of anger. A person who can't acknowledge their needs may engage in sort of self-destructive behavior that forces other people to take care of them. A far healthier approach would involve finding ways to get your needs met. That means getting a massage or asking your partner or a friend to scratch your back. It gives you the power to really meet the need that is underlying that behavior in a more direct way. Disowned parts of ourselves may represent sort of very normal instincts that become excessive or distorted because they were denied and repressed and not given a safe outlet. So a need for love that can't be acknowledged can turn into obsessive eating or drinking or picking bad partners. We often seek out partners and relationships with the people who are like one of our shadow parts. A caring and responsible person, for example, may be drawn to people who are kind of insensitive or irresponsible because it represents a part of themselves they can't own. We also sometimes project our disowned good qualities onto somebody else, and we overvalue them. I could never be as smart as they are. I could never be as competent as they are. So we minimize our own strengths and project our disowned strengths because we were told that we're not smart. We were told we're not, gifted or good. We project them onto other people and sometimes think they have all that, but don't own the fact that we have it too, but we're not taught to embrace it and recognize it. So we also sometimes project our good qualities onto other people and then don't own them within ourselves. We also will judge in others the things we can't accept within ourselves. So the problem with all of this is you're not really allowing yourself as rich a life as you're capable of having. So self-awareness in combination with compassion and understanding of why you hid those parts can lead to greater self-acceptance and more authentic connections with others because you're bringing more of who you are to your life, to your relationships. And this is part of why we want to go back and reclaim these parts of ourselves, or at least understand them better. So here's some common kind of problems people develop with their disowned parts, the disowned parts of themselves that drive problematic behavior. So for example, drinking, eating, shopping too much often reflects a deep unmet need for something that soothes you. When you disown the part of you that needs affection and nurturing, it might express itself indirectly in sort of obsessive attempts to fill yourself up. Because I think the way we feel filled up as children is when we feel loved, and that's what we need as adults, to feel loved, and that fills us up. But if we don't know how to ask for that, or we don't know how to get that, or we don't know how to let it in, we may constantly try to fill ourselves up with something else. Someone said you can't get enough of what you don't really need. So if what you really need is love, no amount of food, no amount of booze, no amount of sex, or any other kind of compulsive behavior is really going to fill up that void. You can't get enough of what you don't really need. You don't need another drink. You need a hug. You aren't hungry for you. You need a lap to put your head in. That's the importance of understanding, these disarmed parts, what's really driving some of this behavior. And these are very common. Drinking and substance abuse, or any kind of attempt to fill the void, are usually an indication that you didn't get enough love. And that's an important thing to understand. Drinking and substance abuse can also be linked to trying to shut off that inner critic. I know when I was younger, I've had a drink or two, that self-critic would quiet down. Of course, it lays in wait for you. So if you wake up the next day with a hangover, it beats you up even more, and you get an even worse attack from your inner critic. But that's not an uncommon thing. People can shut off that inner critic with alcohol. If you're someone who just feels numb a lot and you're just not sure what you're feeling, you probably grew up in a situation where it wasn't safe to feel your feelings, let alone express them. So you had to disown the parts of yourself that have strong feelings like anger or fear or sadness. And again, you just got so good at numbing it out when you were a kid, or sort of dissociating. That means you're disconnecting with your internal experience, that it's automatic for you as an adult. Maybe as a child you were told, you cry and the first response is, I'll give you something to cry about. So what do you learn? You learn that you better hide your sadness, and you get very good at just shutting off your feelings. We'll also shut off our feelings as children when we know there's no one that we can go to with those feelings who are going to soothe us or be present with us. People take care of other people's needs but ignore their own. Chances are their needs weren't responded to when they were children. And sometimes it's subtle. I remember somebody who just told me that her mother was always like reading books, and anytime she came to her and wanted to show her something she drew, or just normal kind of kid needing normal kind of kid attention, her mother would be annoyed because she really just wanted to read her book. So the message was not beaten into her. It was very subtle, but the message was, you're a burden, you're an inconvenience. So you grow up feeling like if you have needs, that's going to burden people and they're not going to want to give you their attention. So you disown those parts of yourself. You disown those inconvenient needs. Rather than feel that constant disappointment as a child, you convince yourself, I didn't need it anyway. And you then give to others what you really need for yourself. That's not uncommon, to project your needs onto other people, and you take care of other people partly because that's the only way you got rewarded, and also because it's not okay for you to need to be taken care of. So putting yourself last, that's common for people who grew up in a family where they had to be like the little grown up, the parentified child, we call it. You disown the child parts of yourself from younger ages, and you continue that pattern as an adult. If you're a perfectionist, you may rarely make mistakes, but you still live in fear of making them. And again, maybe deeply rooted in feelings of shame or a fear that no matter how good you were, it was never enough, that some perceived imperfection or flaw would wipe out all the good. So if you disown and desperately try to hide your imperfections, you really haven't gotten to understand something that's crucial that we all understand, which is you can't be perfect if you're human. To be human is to be imperfect. That's something we call healthy shame. The recognition that by definition, if you are human, you're not going to be perfect. It isn't possible. Other ways that disowned parts show up are, you may have a reluctance to take risks. I've mentioned this before, and possibly fail because you're really afraid of being shamed or people finding out that you're flawed in some way. And you can't tolerate that vulnerability of doing something new or scary because you just don't want to fail and have people judge you. But think about all the ways in which you then limit your world, all the risks you don't take, all the things you don't try. I've noticed as we get older, and this is an issue for a lot of us who've been very competent adults now as retirees or something, we want to try something new, but we're not used to being beginners. We're not used to like starting to do something like play the piano and realize we're not very good at this and it's going to take time to get good at it. But we're used to being competent adults and we don't feel very comfortable not being good at something right out of the gate. But then you really limit your ability to learn something new and try something different in your retirement. So again, think about that. That need to be perfect can really limit your life. You'll really set up barriers in your life to avoid risking the possibility of making a mistake and being judged. Many of us carry around a secret fear that we are somehow flawed or unlovable or inadequate. And again, it's usually due to not feeling sufficiently loved in childhood. And it's almost intolerable for a child to believe that the parent wants to hurt them, as Judith Herman said, or doesn't love them. So they'd rather conclude that they're insufficient. And that's a way to avoid the pain of realizing your parents really aren't there for you. Some of our poor choices in relationships represent an attempt to fix a relationship with one of your parents. So if you had an abusive or absentee father, you may pick partners who initially appear to be men who will protect you, but they turn out to be men from whom you need protection. And it's very subtle. I don't think people necessarily go out picking bad guys. I think a lot of the bad guys are very good at looking good in the beginning. And unfortunately, they're very good at charming people, but then when they get into a relationship, they stop being charming and you see who they really are. And often it's too much like a parent you were trying to get away from, or trying to have a relationship that would counter that. If you pick someone who is distant, you may believe you can change them and finally win the attention maybe you never won from your father. Again, that's rooted in disowning and trying to avoid the parts of you that are grieving over the fact that you didn't get that love from your father. still trying to fix it by somebody else. And most of us, I think, at this point realize you can't really change people very much. I'm even in the business of changing people. It's very hard for people to change. So, if you get into a relationship thinking I'm going to change this person, I'll finally be attentive, even though he's very distant, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's hard to change when you want to change. And a lot of people who don't even think they need to change are the ones who need to change the most. They're never going to change. Sometimes, again, we do pick partners that mistreat us or neglect us because, we don't really feel we're worthy of love because of our experiences growing up. And again, that's rooted in disowning the parts of yourself that really need and want love. Perhaps you keep people at a distance because letting your heart open fully is the ultimate act of vulnerability. If in the past you were hurt when you did this, you build invisible walls and you always keep people at a safe distance. You're walling away a part of yourself that can feel vulnerable, but in an effort to protect that person from their feelings of vulnerability, you actually imprison them. So they always feel vulnerable because they're always hiding behind a wall. They never get the connections that make them feel powerful and loved. Really good Brene Brown talk. You've heard me talk about it before. It's one of the most popular TED Talks. It's called The Power of Vulnerability. And she's really talking about the challenge in life of allowing yourself to be vulnerable. So, we really limit ourselves when we try to avoid feelings of vulnerability. Problems saying no and people pleasing usually develop because we were abandoned or judged or responded to angrily if we didn't try to make other people happy. So you disown the angry and needy parts of yourself. You disown the part of you that wants to say no. How you respond to authority figures is often a really good reflection of how you're made to feel and forced to act around a difficult parent. As I've already said, obsessive behaviors can also be a way to control anxiety. What I mean by that is you focus all of your anxiety in one area and we channel all of it. So for example, phobias, people have phobias. What they're doing is they're probably taking a wide span of anxiety and narrowing it and putting on just one particular thing as a way to focus their anxiety to make it feel more controllable. The choice of obsessions really often reveals the sort of deeply personal nature of that particular action. For example, people who engage in obsessive washing or showering may be people who were made to feel dirty as children, which might be connected to child sexual abuse. And remember, the memory of actual abuse or the feelings associated with that really reside deeply in disowned parts of the self, and some of it will remain unconscious all of our lives if we don't focus on it. You've heard me talk again about this. We can experience trauma. When we experience trauma as a child, it's only recorded in the right side of the brain. Which is particularly significant because the right hemisphere doesn't have words. So you're likely to find it hard to accurately recall and articulate things from your childhood. Alan Shore explains that the right hemisphere of the brain doesn't have words. It is more visual. We're right hemisphere dominated when we're children. Left hemisphere is the more cognitive, thinking, logical part of ourselves, but we are much more right hemisphere dominated as we are children. And she says because the right hemisphere of the brain is more visual and not words, it affects our ability to retain those memories and articulate those memories. He said that the right hemisphere of the brain is more visual, but it does read body language and facial expressions. He writes, traumatic memories are recorded in the right hemisphere outside of conscious awareness, and this realm represents the traumatic memories in imagistic forms along with the survival behaviors employed as a result of that abuse. And this allows for the fact that the emotional learning of the right, especially of stressful and threatening experiences, can be unknown to the left. So we have images that are related to childhood abuse. We have strategies of coping that are in an unconscious part of the brain, the right hemisphere of the brain, and they're often not even consciously known to the left hemisphere of the brain. It's very interesting what we're learning about the brain and how much more it explains, like people being unable to remember things that happened in their childhood. So it's entirely possible that childhood experiences, especially young childhood experiences, are stored as visual images and the survival behaviors that we adopted to cope with that trauma. But again, why we did that is not available to the left side of the brain, which is where you develop verbal and narrative memory. Narrative memory being the ability to tell stories about what's happening to you and make sense of what's happening to you by, creating a storyline about it. And I don't mean a fictional storyline, but a storyline that makes sense of what you might have experienced growing up. So what that means is that you may engage in behaviors that were developed very early in life that are not tied to some conscious memory. Your coping mechanisms evolved without a conscious understanding of why you developed them. So there's a lot more I can say about that, but it's important to remember that there is real physiology involved in here, and there's a reason why we often can't access traumatic memories that or access the why behind some of our behavior, because a lot of it evolved in a more unconscious part of the brain, or it wasn't available to the more conscious of the part of the brain. So just to give you some sense of why this is so complicated. Sometimes examining disowned parts of self can lead to memories being recalled. It can also, you don't necessarily have to retain those, access those memories in order to think about ways to reclaim hurt parts of yourself and treat them differently. Depression is probably caused by a wide range of symptoms. Depression could be rooted in biochemical imbalances. Some people believe that depression is rooted in turning the anger back on the self. Some people believe that depression is related to what's called learned helplessness, that feeling that you're stuck and you don't have the power to change it. Depression may represent an attempt to withdraw from a painful world. Depression may reflect the need to shed a former self and create a more authentic self, but we don't know how to get there. It can be rooted in too much social isolation or too many unmet needs. So reclaiming parts of you that are angry, so you're not turning it all back on yourself all the time, reclaiming parts of you that can be proactive and help you break out of learned helplessness, reclaiming parts of you that are able to deal with the difficult world, and reclaiming parts of you that do know how to connect with others, that can really play a role in improving depression. So even depression is helped by looking at disowned parts of the self. So that's why it's so important to go back and reclaim these parts. Generalizations can be made, but each person's problematic behavior or symptoms is a really unique coping mechanism that once served them but now undermines them. We all have them. But understanding the roots requires a willingness to dive deep and see what's right about what's wrong. Understanding that the problems you face today were the best you could do as a child to cope with the difficulty can also expand your compassion for yourself. So not only does it give you important information that helps you unhook from those behaviors, but it also helps you to start to develop some compassion for yourself, because you begin to realize, I adopted this strategy when I was just a little kid. And like every other little kid, I just wanted to feel loved and special and wanted, my mother to calm down. So I did everything I could to try to calm her down. When you begin to realize where this comes from, who you were, how young you were when you probably developed some of these coping mechanisms, I think it's easier to develop some compassion for those parts of yourself, because understanding the problems you face today, coming from a place that was the best you could do as a child, really can help you get at the root of why you engage in problematic behaviors today. But it also really requires you to have some compassion for the part of you, the person you were when you adopted some of those strategies. So let me end by just talking a little bit how to learn to love all the parts of yourself. Well, the whole groundwork of what I've been saying is the key. It's essential that any attempts to examine a source of embarrassment or frustration or problematic behavior, it has to start with eyes of compassion. You have to understand first, with a kind heart, why you develop these coping strategies. Donna Markova wrote a book called No Enemies Within, a creative process for discovering what's right about what's wrong. She labels the unclaimed parts of ourselves, which create problematic behaviors, the enemy within. And she writes, and really think about this, in every wounding, there is a potential of a gift for healing. You may begin to sense that when you are willing to listen to your enemy through your heart, when your eyes see it through the light of compassion, when you allow yourself to touch it with mercy, when you reach to understand the needs of the wounded warrior and the helpless healer within, when you give the seeker of the freedom to search for meaning in the darkness, your journey to wholeness has turned a corner and is inclined toward the light. So it's absolutely essential that you proceed with eyes of compassion and mercy and kindness to the younger parts of yourself that develop some of these. So some of these messy rooms, they deserve a whole lot of love, and they deserve you taking the lessons they have to teach you, but you can only get them by looking in those rooms with eyes of compassion. You have to look at the dimensions of your personality that you dislike, that you want to disown, with eyes of compassion. You need to ask yourself, what happened growing up or when I got older that made me hide this part of me away? What role did I play in my family? Did I always have to be the optimistic one? Did I always have to be the helper? Was it difficult to win love from one or both of your parents? Were your feelings responded to in a caring way when you were a child? What uncomfortable feelings might you be hiding, might your behavior be hiding or secretly trying to express? What unmet needs may the behavior trying to get met or trying to hide? So take time to know your internal enemy, the parts of yourself that you don't like. Get to the root of it. As Dharma Markova says, so what's right about what's wrong with you? I'm not going to ask you to kiss the garbage. I like that line. What is important in this practice is that you enter into an intuitive conversation with your enemy. And she's talking about the disowned parts of yourself, the parts of you that don't like. It's to enter into an intuitive conversation with your enemy about its needs, to braille your way through, deep into the center of it. Embrace it, jiggle it in your arms, walk with it, making cooing sounds the way you would with a baby that you loved until you could sense what she needed. So take these hurt parts of yourself, these disowned parts of yourself, pick them up like the baby they are and coo to them and talk to them. Because if you can figure out what wound gave rise to the problem, you can address that underlying wound, and you can find healthier ways to give those disowned parts of yourself expression. Figure out how you can safely express the emotions you weren't allowed to express as a child. How can you ask for more support in your life? How can you ask more directly for help with unmet needs? How can you safely release the forbidden feelings, which keep those beliefs anchored in place? If you're never allowed to feel angry as a child, you've been unable to grieve the losses of your childhood, you may really need to release a backlog of some of those feelings. Therapy is a very good, safe mechanism for doing that, but there's always safe ways to express your feelings. Finally, change that internal dialogue. Imagine a more loving person speaking to the inner child. Don't beat yourself. Don't beat yourself up. Don't should on yourself. You're doing the best you can. And here's a fairy tale that she tells in the beginning of the book, or a fable that I think is just brilliant. Once upon a time, a long time ago, and very far from here, a great Tibetan poet named Milarepa studied and meditated for decades. He traveled the countryside, teaching the practice of compassion and mercy to the villagers he met. He faced many hardships, difficulties, and sorrow, and transformed them into a path of his awakening. Finally, it was time to return to the small hut he called home. He had carried its memory in his head through all the years of his journey. Much to his surprise, upon entering, he found it filled with enemies of every kind, terrifying, horrifying, monstrous demons that would make most people run. But Milarepa was not most people. Inhaling and exhaling slowly 3 times, he turned toward the demons, fully present and aware. He looked deeply into the eyes of each, bowing in respect, and said, "You are here in my home now. I honor you and open myself to what you have to teach me." As soon as he uttered these words, all of the enemies save 5 disappeared. The ones that remained were grisly, raw, and huge. Milarepa bowed once more and began to sing a song to them, a sweet melody, resonant with caring for the ways these beasts had suffered, and curiosity about what they needed and how he could help them. As the last notes left his lips, 4 of the demons disappeared into thin air. Now only one nasty creature was left, fangs dripping evil, nostrils flaming, opened jaws revealing a dark, foul black throat. Milarepa stepped closer to this huge demon, breathed deeply into his own belly, and said with quiet compassion, "I must understand your pain and what it is you need in order to be healed." Then he put his head in the mouth of his enemy. In that instant, the demon disappeared and Milarepa was home at last. This is what is being suggested in her book, The No Enemies Within. You need to sing a melody resonant with caring for the ways you have been wounded emotionally, and to have curiosity about what you still need. The ultimate challenge really is to reparent yourself, to use internal messages that are validating, but also to seek love and care from people around you. It's time to treat yourself the way you should have been treated as a child. And especially if you had to face that alone, get support from other people. Let this time be a time when others are there to support you and help you. Open up more to others. I know we're running out of time. Start with the people that you feel safe with, or join a group with people who have similar interests. But start slowly by sort of testing the waters. For example, you could tell a friend, sometimes I think I'm angry about something, but I feel it's bad to say that out loud. And then see how they respond. Some people might say, God, I have the same feeling. You learn in this manner which friends can understand or can be encouraged to understand, who are educable about emotions. So test the waters, find the people that you can open up with more. Also make sure that you're allowing it to be more of a two-way street, to share and to listen. Work to make your outside behavior more congruent with your internal feelings. Share feelings, not just opinions or thoughts. Sharing feelings is what really leads to greater closeness. Communicate in the first person. Start with sentences like I rather than you. For example, I'm feeling angry rather than you made me angry. And learn to open your heart and find people with whom you can be yourself, warts and all. I'm going to end with a poem by Rumi called The Great House, the Guest House. This being human is a guest house, every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He might be cleaning you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from the beyond. And that's what we're really saying. Greet all the parts of yourself, see what they have to teach you. And you don't have to kiss the garbage. You don't have to let them take over and run your life. They'll have less control over you if you actually embrace them. 2 more quotes. To heal is to touch with love that which we previously touched with fear. And finally, healing is embracing what is most feared. Healing is opening what has been closed, softening what has been hardened into obstruction. Healing is learning to trust life. So I know I threw a lot at you. So unlike me, right? We will record this, and if you have people that you think should see it, we will be sending out the link. Kathleen, do we want to see if we have people that have?
Thank you everybody so much for coming, and thank you so much, Dr. Judy, for this wonderful information. I hope everybody has a wonderful 2023, and Delaware Hospice is here for you. We are more than just hospice. We do have programs for every stage of a serious illness. So don't hesitate. If you or a loved one has been diagnosed with a serious illness, please feel free to call us, and we are here for you to lend a sympathetic ear. You can ask us questions, and we can help you find the program that's for you or your loved one. Thank you all.